Spoiler alert, creating a successful small maker business is, well, sort of boring, at least in some ways. And after journeying alongside almost 100 makers inside of the community for the last 3-ish years or so, talking a lot specifically about business and strategy, I've realized most of us don't actually expect it to be so boring. Sticking with something and not trying that shiny new thing instead is boring. Showing up day after day, whether you feel inspired or not, is boring. So for us creatives who are dreaming about quitting those boring day jobs to pursue a fulfilling life of making and craft and art and interesting new ideas, how could starting a small business rooted in all art has to offer us possibly be boring? That's what we're going to dig into on today's solo episode of The Maker's Playbook, right after this quick word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by The Community. With now over 100 makers from all over the world, The Community is where we can dive deeper into any of the topics we've started to talk about here on the podcast. Whether it's the discussion I started back on episode 509 about choosing between Etsy or your own website, or trying to sort out what type of side hustle or full-time business works for your own personal life, after hearing so many different kinds of stories on the podcast. If you've been listening along and find yourself wishing for more at the end of any episode, The Community is that more. It is quite literally the personification of the phrase that I end every single podcast episode with. Together, we've got this. Learn about more of the perks of membership by visiting makersplaybook.com/community, or send me a message and I can put you in touch with one of our members to get an insider's perspective. Now, on with the show. Welcome to The Maker's Playbook, the show where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, seasoned entrepreneur of 14 years, Rebecca Ikes Kara. As makers, we are inherently creative people. We love trying new things. We get excited about new possibilities. Heck, half the reason many of us started our own businesses was because we got bored with the traditional 9-to-5 grind. But here's the thing that nobody really talks about. The most successful businesses, they're often pretty boring in their day-to-day operations. I know, that's not the quick, simple, trendy business advice you were hoping for, but it's the truth. Let me give you one of my own examples. When I first started my business, I tried to promote it every single way I could think of. I posted regularly on social media, which, frankly, at the time was actually only Facebook, if you can imagine that. I wrote a regular blog. I shared the blog posts on Pinterest. I paid for advertising in a magazine, and I also paid for a booth at an annual bridal show where thousands of people would come walking through. I showed up to networking events, and then when Instagram came along, I added that to my list of things to do as well. But as time went on, I started noticing where my favorite clients actually came from. And it was never actually from the shiny new thing I had just added to my long list of to-do items, because it was the thing that everyone was saying you had to do in order to succeed. You'd be missing out if you weren't doing that thing. Now, this is a subject for another podcast episode entirely, but frankly, I am so very tired of all of the people that say things online like, if you aren't doing this, then you're missing out, or some other version of that same phrase. Honestly, if you find yourself ever reading a page on a website or a post on Instagram or wherever to some online course or something you can buy or purchase that ever uses a phrase like, if you aren't doing this, then I would like to just gently encourage you to run the other way immediately. There's way more to unpack on that subject, so let me get back to the boring stuff first. Since I started with the photography example, let's stick with that just for the sake of boring consistency, shall we? So, enter my friends Jeff and Erin Youngren. Now, Jeff and Erin started their photography business about 3 years before I did, so not a dramatic difference. And while maybe they had a small initial period of trying out all of the things, just like I did, because yes, when you are in the very, very beginning stages, just getting started, there is, of course, a natural period of try and see just about everything. Throw all of the spaghetti on the wall. However, Jeff and Erin's period of time doing all the things was much, much shorter than my own. By the time I met them in 2011, they had zeroed in on the fact that they would focus primarily just on marketing their business via their blog. They reshared that blog on social media, sure, but the content and the photos and everything they needed for social were already prepared because of the blog post, so they didn't actually need to create anything else. They focused on their blog and on networking with fellow event industry colleagues, and that's about it, honestly. Over the course of the next decade, while we would both grow successful businesses, I would look at Jeff and Erin with awe. While I was over in Chicago constantly hustling, showing up to any and every networking event, burning the candle at both ends, feeling like I was barely getting any traction, and occasionally working with my dream couples, Jeff and Erin were hanging out in beautiful San Diego, crushing it. They worked with ideal client after ideal client. They got published in major magazines without paying for advertising, and in many ways became a household name in the world of wedding photographers. How was it that they were doing less marketing than I was, and yet getting better results? This is where the boring part comes in. And trust me on this, because I have clearly learned the hard way. The businesses that actually succeed, they pick a strategy and they stick with it. Not for a week, not for a month, not even for 3 or 6 months. Often they stick with it for years. They show up day after day doing the same things consistently. They gather the data, they make small incremental improvements based on that data. And yes, it can feel mind-numbingly boring sometimes. But here's the kicker. That consistency, that boring approach, that's what actually leads to growth. That's what builds trust with your audience. That's what helps you understand what's actually working and what isn't. Erin wrote that blog something like 3 times a week for years. Years, my friends. Again, this is where the boring part comes in. Doing the exact same thing over and over again for years can be an incredibly difficult thing for us as creatives. Think about some of your favorite makers that you follow online. The ones who are actually full-time making a living from their work. I bet if you scroll through their feed, you'll notice patterns. Consistent posting schedules maybe it's similar types of content, regular launches or sales. In many ways, it starts to get boring. But that consistency is exactly what's helping them succeed. Now, I can already hear some of you saying, but Rebecca, I get bored doing the same thing over and over again. I can't possibly do that. Trust me, I get it. As someone who can quickly see the value in the new shiny strategy, as someone who's been in the trenches of this making a living from the things we make thing for a very long time now, I deeply understand the desire or better, the hope that maybe this new thing that everyone says is going to be the solution to success will finally be the fast solution to success I've been looking for. I understand that urge to change, especially to something new, especially when the thing you have been doing doesn't feel like it's working. But here's what I've learned to do instead of giving into that urge. Channel that creative energy into your actual making, into your art, into your craft. That's where innovation really shines anyways. That's where you want to be creative, right? The business side, that's where boring can be helpful. If you're exhausted by the idea of having to promote your work, make it simple. Create some templates that you can use over and over again. Do the same thing over and over again. Boring can help us systematize the stuff we don't actually like to do. Boring can help us get the things we don't want to do but need to do done. And done faster with less mental energy, freeing us up to focus that creativity on the work that we do love to make. And frankly, staying consistently boring with the business side of things can be more helpful to actually achieving the things that you want. It's like throwing a pot on the wheel. You don't reinvent your centering technique every time you sit down. You don't completely change how you pull up the walls each time. You perfect those basic techniques through repetition, which then frees you up to be creative with the forms and the designs you actually really want to make. The same principle applies to business. When you have a solid, consistent system in place, when you're not constantly reinventing your marketing strategy or changing your pricing structure or switching up your entire business model, that's when you actually have the mental space to be creative where it counts. Here's a hard truth, and I mean this with all of the love in my heart. Sometimes we use trying something new, quote unquote, as a way to avoid facing the reality that building a business takes time. And it's hard. When something doesn't work immediately, it's tempting to say, well, that didn't work. Let me go try something else. But often, it didn't work because we didn't give it enough time to work. Or we didn't give it enough time to test to figure out why it didn't work. For example, last week I posted a carousel post on Instagram about the benefits of using color theory to make your photos better. Now, for the last year or so, I have been testing the success rate of carousel posts versus reels on my own Instagram. Number one, because we all know how exhausting reels can be to make, and so I was really hoping carousel posts might do better. And number two, because I had a few carousel posts do really, really well, for me at least, and that had given me the theory that perhaps the form of content for my specific audience, you, and my specific subject, photography, well, perhaps that form of content, carousel posts, is what might work best for the mixture of those three unique things together. Now hang with me because I'm going to read off some numbers. Because this hypothesis of mine started when the post I had shared after NCECA of last year took off. At the time of me writing this podcast episode, it has 3,627 likes and 1,880 saves. Now, those numbers for me are pretty darn huge. So for the past year, I've focused on mostly sharing photo tips via a carousel-style post when I was sharing a photo tip on Instagram. And it's been working. But that color wheel post last week, well, it's the least successful post I've had in a while when it comes to photo tips. At only 131 likes and 39 shares, I began to panic a little bit. Does this strategy of mine not work anymore? Did everyone really leave Instagram after all of the political chaos that we're going through? And now I need to redo everything to be able to post it on Blue Sky? Should I do something different? Yeah, I spiraled down a rabbit hole of fear and sent a message to my favorite Instagram strategy mentor, Allie Mason, in a pretty big panic. At which point, Allie reminded me, one post is not a data set. Doing one thing once does not actually tell us anything meaningful. We have to stay consistent or boring in order to get enough data or information. Right. Deep down, I knew that. So I looked back at some other recent photo tip carousel posts, and the next most recent one I had shared has 849 likes and 879 shares. Now, maybe that's not as good as the NCICA post, but that's a heck of a lot better than 39. The point of this too long of an example story is this. Because I had done the same thing over and over again, sharing photo tips via a carousel-style post for nearly a year, I can easily look at my last post about the color wheel and compare it to other, more successful posts. And best of all, I can see why that post about the color wheel didn't do as well. It's so much more obvious now. The first image of that color wheel post is different than the most popular posts. Instead of it being a statement like the popular ones, it's a question. Instead of a solid colored background with bold text that's really easy to read, even if it's really, really tiny, it's text over the top of an image, which is a little less easy to read. Now, these may sound like small, silly differences, but in the land of social media, they can clearly make a big impact. But also, in the land of the boring, I would not have been able to pull out these differences if I was constantly doing something new and different with every single post. At that point, there would be too many variables to try and figure out why one worked and the other didn't. So I would be left with having to still try all of the things constantly, wondering what works and what doesn't. It's a quick route to burnout and exhaustion. I wouldn't be able to pull the data without the boringness of committing to doing the same thing over and over and over again. But look, I'm not saying you should never try new things or adapt your strategy. Of course you should. Because sometimes when we commit to doing the same boring thing over and over, after 6 months, the data actually shows us, in fact, it doesn't work, and we do need to change. But there's a difference between making informed decisions based on actual data and jumping from strategy to strategy because you're bored or impatient or some online ad told you that their course or system or offer or PDF or whatever other thing is the magic solution to all of your business problems. Trust me, my impatience has actually slowed my progress too many times to count. So I know that this sucks to hear, but staying the course, even when it feels like nothing is happening, is often the actual answer to something happening. Think about it this way. How many times do you have to see something new before you take the risk and buy the thing? I get fed a lot of ads on Instagram, and I'm sure you do too. And I skip past a lot of ads on Instagram. But I have wound up actually making purchases from some of those ads a handful of times over the last year or so. However, I can confidently say I have never made a purchase the first time I saw an ad. I had to see that ad maybe another 3, 5, 10, 20 times before I even clicked into the website to check it out further. And then usually that website tab probably stayed open on my phone for a couple of months, during which I probably saw more ads, or maybe I saw a friend share something about the same company, and then eventually I finally made a purchase. It's the same for our small businesses. You've probably heard the phrase, people buy from people they know, like, and trust. In fact, you've probably heard the phrase, know, like, and trust a million times if you've spent any time at all listening to marketing advice. But how do we get a brand new person to know, like, and trust us? By showing up consistently, boringly, again and again. Now, one quick clarifying point here. When I say consistently, I don't necessarily mean in the calendar sense of the word. Sure, yes, it's helpful to consistently post on the same days at the same times of the week every single time. That's one form of consistency. But consistency can also mean showing up in the same way, with the same message and the same values, maybe even with the same aesthetic, if you're to that point in your making life. Again and again and again. For example, when I teach photography, I consistently focus on breaking down complex concepts into bite-sized bits of information. I am consistently committed to offering solutions that you can implement using whatever resources you already have available to you. I consistently show how a photography tip or trick can be used both with a cell phone or a regular camera. If all of a sudden, because I thought it was going to work faster or make me go viral or something, I started making videos about the latest and greatest piece of equipment or technology and why you should buy it, that would be odd. It would make you wonder, what the heck is going on with Rebecca? It would be inconsistent with the message I have committed to over the last 4 years. The fact that together we can have you taking great photos in less time using whatever you already have available. Sure, do I try to consistently post at the same time on the same days of the same week every week? Yeah, I try. I don't always succeed at it. But when I do post, the message is what is consistent. Am I tempted by seeing someone post something that goes viral and ask myself, should I do that instead? Would we grow faster, sell more, be more quote unquote successful if I did something else? Of course I wonder that. I'm human. I want my small maker business to be successful just like you want yours to be. And frankly, my mortgage lender also wants my business to be successful. But having made these mistakes before, having made it harder to actually reach the version of success that I wanted, because I was spreading myself too thin and scattered across too many different new shiny ideas without enough time to truly commit to any one in particular, well, now I know better. I can quiet down that fear faster than I used to. I can look at my long-term goals and understand why I chose to test this one hypothesis right now and know that I have to stick with it for at least 6 months in order to actually get enough information to understand what I should do next. And yes, 6 months can feel like a really long time to be testing out the same idea over and over and over again. I did, after all, start this episode by telling you how boring business can be. The idea of how long it takes to figure out what's working and what's not bring up a subject that has been particularly top of mind for me right now as I go all in on this career transition from wedding photographer to online educator, teaching all of you how to not only take better photos faster of your work, quickly and easily, but also sharing these hard-earned business tips that most likely none of us were ever taught in school or at a residency or at a workshop or wherever else you may have recently learned your craft. The point. This is where we need to talk about runway. And I don't mean Project Runway or anything having to do with fashion. I'm talking about how long you can sustain doing these boring, repetitive tasks before you need to see the results. Because here's another truth about business that nobody likes to talk about. It takes a lot longer than most of us expect to have a business that works. And by works, I mean, quite frankly, pays the bills and provides a livable salary for ourselves. Think about it. If you're posting on Instagram once a week, it's going to take months to gather enough data to understand what your audience responds to. If you're launching products quarterly, it might take 2 or 3 years to really see any kind of trends in your sales patterns. This is why so many businesses can sometimes fail in the first year or two. Not because their products weren't good enough, but because they didn't give themselves a long enough runway to make it work. By runway, I mean the time between when they started the business and when we needed the business to be making enough money to sustain ourselves and pay the bills. Maybe you're starting a business by using money that you've saved up in a savings account over a long period of time of working for someone else. And now you've taken the leap to go full-time. Or maybe you took out a business loan to cover the initial costs and you need to pay that back on a very clearly defined schedule. Or maybe you're working a part-time job that adds a little bit of income, but you still need your business to earn a certain amount in the coming months in order to fully pay those bills. Your runway is the amount of time between starting something and, frankly, when the cash you previously saved up or took a loan out for runs out. Maybe that savings account you put together before you quit your job covers 6 months of personal expenses. Maybe it's 3 months. Maybe it's a year. Whatever it is, that's your runway. And the big scary question, this question on my own mind right now, is do we have a long enough runway? Because there are plenty of examples of successful businesses doing what we do. There are indeed full-time studio potters who make a living solely from making and selling the work that they make. And more importantly, the work that they like to make. There are endless examples of people who teach online, who host virtual communities and memberships. These businesses can work. It's just a matter of, number one, did we save up enough to give the business enough time to grow? Number two, are we patient enough to put in the effort to stick to the plan, to do the boring things, to actually get the business to work? And number three, do we have the energy to put in that effort at a pace that matches the runway we gave ourselves to make this business work? You can, of course, get a successful business launched in as short as, let's say, 6 months. But the speed at which you might have to work for those 6 months, the number of hours each day spent on the business, might be a bit longer than you prefer. Or longer, potentially, than you are physically able to commit to. Going back to Instagram as the ever persistent, easy example. If I post 1 time a week every week for a year, that is a type of consistency. But the amount of growth I'll see over that time is going to look a lot different than if I post every single day, every single week for an entire year. In many ways, your runway to building a successful business, as stale and as boring as it sounds, is just a numbers game. Sure, you might get lucky and hit it big quickly, but for most of us, it's a slow, steady climb. And that climb requires us to stick with those boring, consistent actions long enough to actually see the results. Or to actually have enough data to make an informed decision if we do need to make a change. Rather than throwing spaghetti at the wall, constantly, which is exhausting. And frankly, a waste of perfectly good pasta. But I digress. One more metaphor before I wrap this up. If business more often than not is a slow and steady climb, think of that shiny, new, tempting thing that's trying to distract you and promising a faster elevator ride to the top of the mountain, skipping right past the arduous climb. Well, think of it, in fact, not as an actual elevator ride, but more like a bad detour. Instead of staying on the path, you take the detour, and at first the climb is actually going much faster. It's working, hooray! But soon, the pace of the climb returns right back to the speed that it was at before. Slow, long, difficult, boring. Only now, instead of being farther along on your first path, you realize you've actually just gone east instead of north. You aren't all that much farther up the mountain. In fact, you're basically in the same place that you were before, but you've lost a couple of days' worth of your hike, and now you also need to find your way back to where you were before in order to keep going. It's boring to stay on the same path, especially when it seems like the view might just be a little bit over there if you make a turn. But the detours, even while sometimes giving us a glimpse at a decent view, just get us all twisted around and confused. The real view we're dreaming about, the view at the top of the mountain, well, that's the thing you finally see at the end of what is often a very boring path. As always, if you're ready to tear your hair out with all the boring stuff, if the boring is still actually feeling overwhelming, and it's hard to figure out what is a detour versus what is the actual unique path that you need to take for your own unique dreams, well, the community is the place online where over 100 other makers are finding their own path and supporting each other amidst the boredom to stick to it. Right now, we're digging into the absolutely necessary, but sometimes boring, need for financial systems in our businesses, whether they're side hustles or full-time. But I have to say, the custom financial playbook that Shawneen made for all of us is far from boring. In fact, according to a number of our members, they're actually having a little bit of fun. So you can learn more about all the very non-boring perks the community has to offer by visiting makersplaybook.com/community. And if right now doesn't feel like the right time for you to come have a peek into the community, but you want to try and sort out what your own path for boring consistency might look like, then I'd recommend scrolling all the way back to episode 313, titled The Myth of Growth, and have a listen. I hope it's the permission that you need to persist along your own unique path, amidst and despite the shouts from the internet telling you about all the shiny new things you should be doing. Maybe the next time you get the impatient itch to try the latest new trendy thing, you'll pause and ask yourself, does this really line up with my goals? Or am I just bored and hoping for a fast solution? Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do to find your own version of success for your small business or side hustle is to be boring. Until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality. Because together, we've got this. Audio post-production of this podcast is made possible by help from Christy Kotzfan, with promotional material assistance from Queenie Maliki. The Maker's Playbook podcast is recorded on the original homelands of the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee people, where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality. Because together, we've got this.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.